Okay, all right. Hello. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. How are you? I hope you're doing well. I hope you're ready for a great conversation I had with my guest, Courtney Stallings. She is the author of an incredible book, one that I think will very much interest Nostalgia Trap listeners. It's called Laura's Ghost: Women Speak About Twin Peaks. And it is just that. It's a collection of essays and interviews and Q&As with the fan community, women speaking about Twin Peaks, and particularly about Laura Palmer and what the character of Laura Palmer means to them. This was, for me, a really great way to think about David Lynch and Lynch's work. As many of you know, Lynch is someone who had a massive impact on me. I know that Lynch is someone who a lot of people are talking about right now because of Twin Peaks: The Return, because of his presence on YouTube and his weather reports. I mean, he's gone from, just in my lifetime, someone who was always sort of an outsider in Hollywood to someone who I think has produced just so much writing and thinking, and I think that's part of what I wanted to get at by talking with Courtney this week. Is how many the diversity of conversations produced by Twin Peaks, produced by Lynch's work. For me, I've wanted to get to Lynch and do some episodes about it, but I wanted to sort of ground it in something. And so this week we're talking about this particular angle on Twin Peaks, which is that it's ultimately a story of a girl, Laura Palmer, being murdered. And, how is it different from all the other, quote unquote, dead girl genre that stretches all the way, from True Detective to all those 90s movies with Ashley Judd and Morgan Freeman that I've mentioned a million times. Twin Peaks is different. And the story of Laura Palmer is different from that, and different from this sort of constant victimization. And what we get at in this conversation is how Laura Palmer's story connects with women who have experienced similar abuse and trauma, including some of the most taboo topics like rape and incest. I mean, Laura Palmer's story is about being raped and murdered by her own father. Spoiler alert, right? I think everyone knows the answer to Twin Peaks, or at least the answer to that initial mystery. But either way, it gets at stuff that, for me, we had a conversation with Claudia a couple weeks ago on the Patreon about American Beauty, and we ended up talking about Blue Velvet as well. And that was a really illuminating conversation for me, because it helped me understand that what I'm looking for and why I connect powerfully with Lynch's work is because he's doing something beyond just that surface level exploration you see in American Beauty. He's trying to get at the really dark, ugly, subterranean depths of the American experience. And it goes beyond just, capitalism. Well, capitalism is bad. I think the left tends to oversimplify things by just saying, well, this happens because of capitalism. But, for me, especially, I think I connect with Lynch's work because he is talking about this white, middle-class, suburban experience. It connects to his own background, but also understanding that experience gives you a particular perspective on darkness. I mean, when I think about the very American-ass, suburban, white, middle-class neighborhood I grew up in Southern California, all these years later, driving through that neighborhood, I can just name house after house after house of dead kids. And by that, I mean kids that died of drug overdoses, gang violence, murder, suicide, all sorts of really ugly shit. And I wonder if that's true of every neighborhood, but it's something that sort of haunts the place. And I think that Lynch's work very much connects to that sort of haunting. I love the idea of the ghost in Courtney's work here, and Laura as a ghost. Because, one friend in particular, there are so many different routes of how this darkness can touch you in America, but one in particular that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because it's been 20 years. I had a friend named Crystal Hamilton, who was an 18-year-old girl who was very troubled. I used to talk to her smoking cigarettes outside Marie Callender's when we both worked there in the late 90s and early 2000s. And we smoked cigarettes and smoked weed together and sort of were just work pals. But when she was 18 years old in March of 2001, she was raped and murdered, and her body was washed up on the beach, and it was part of just the sort of everyday violence of the town. It wasn't even that big of a story. I found out about it a couple months later because I wasn't working at Marie Callender's at the moment it happened. But, it happened just, in a parking lot, just actually a couple 100 feet from where I'm sitting right now. And it's, again, something that was not a huge story in the town. Just, she sort of disappeared. And that disappearance and that violence and that horror is something I think about a lot, in part because of how quotidian it is, how normal it is. And I think that Lynch's work and what Courtney explains to us and what we get into in this conversation, Lynch's work is trying to engage that, is trying to intervene on that evil. And we don't think of him as this political filmmaker. Instead, someone who is trying to use all the tools of storytelling and visual art and cinema to tell us about that darkness and to sort of paint a picture of it for us. And it creates conversations, and the conversations that we end up having on this podcast is one of them. So I hope you enjoy this. And again, I don't usually do trigger warnings on the episodes of Nostalgia Trap, but this one is particularly heavy, and we're touching on some topics that I know people find quite sensitive. So keep that in mind moving forward. Thanks so much. I want to thank Courtney Stallings, by the way, for coming on the show and telling us about this fabulous book and the Twin Peaks fan community, of which I knew very little. So this is a really fun conversation. Go check out our Patreon if you want more Nostalgia Trap episodes. More than half of our content is only for subscribers. So you can find that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We really appreciate the support. We're entirely a listener-supported operation. So thanks for the people that are joining up and subscribing. We have live streams every Thursday on YouTube at 1 p.m. Pacific time if you want to join for that. Thanks so much for the people that join. We will talk to you soon, and here is my conversation with Courtney Stallings. All right. Courtney, thank you so much for joining me. We've been trying to get to talking about Twin Peaks and David Lynch on this program for a while, and I think this is the first official episode that we're doing entirely about Twin Peaks, and I'm so glad it's with you because you wrote and put together an incredible book called Laura's Ghost: Women Speak About Twin Peaks, which gives us an opportunity to talk about something specific with Lynch and Twin Peaks. I find it such a huge topic. How did you fall into this specific topic? Because it seems like what you're doing is an angle on Twin Peaks and David Lynch that I don't really see in terms of the huge fan output that I see everywhere about the show.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me too. I'm excited to be on with you. That is a great question. I have been writing about Twin Peaks and David Lynch for about 9 years, sometimes for fun, sometimes academically. And in writing and covering Twin Peaks, I've come across a lot of women over the years who have said privately or publicly, Laura Palmer meant a lot to me. And I'm a survivor of sexual assault or sexual abuse. And that character, the way that she was portrayed, really tapped into something with me. Mm-hmm. And so I was hearing this over and over and over again. And of course, I have my own personal connection to her. And in 2016, I thought, I want to write a book. And Laura's Ghost really came to me as the topic that I wanted to write about. It wasn't even just like an interest. It was almost like a calling. I don't want to get, supernatural or spiritual.
Please,
on you here, but
if we have to go that way, let's go that way.
Yeah, I mean, it was a calling. Something was telling me to write this book, do this specific book. And I wanted to tell women's stories in the fan community. I didn't know what direction this book was going to take me, but I knew that I had to explore the character of Laura Palmer. I knew I wanted women's voices in there. And of course, many different men, non-binary. There's all sorts of people who could talk about Laura Palmer and what she means to them. But for me specifically, I wanted to explore women's voices in this. So I started out making the book, didn't know what direction was going to go, didn't know the role that Cheryl Lee would play in it, the sort of pivotal role she would play. But I started it and then published it last year. And I got to do what I set out to do, and that's to explore that character and have women's voices in it.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the show. I was too young to watch the show when it originally came out. I mean, I remember it. I remember it being important. I was alive for it, but I certainly couldn't have handled, I don't think, anything of that show when I was younger, and it's something I discovered. But what I do remember about it was the sort of like the who killed Laura Palmer element of it. It's sort of like this, it was close to, I think he was satirizing in some way, like Dallas and the other like nighttime soap operas at the time. But that memory of that that face wrapped in plastic that I think was all in all the TV commercials and in like some sort of the material that I would have seen without seeing the show, it seemed like she was the center of it. And I wonder why you chose the word ghost, because I felt like that was like a really compelling way of like kind of talking about why this character is important. That she's just sort of she sort of haunts the whole show, whether she's on screen or not.
Yeah, and you pointed out something that's really important too. The beginning of Twin Peaks initially was very much like a soap opera, a traditional soap opera, where there's a dead girl found on the beach. Who killed her? That's the mystery. And it could have just stopped there. We could have just said there's a dead girl. We don't know who she is, but it's really about the people who are alive. But it kept coming back to Laura's story. And of course, the film Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me really explored Laura Palmer alive.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we see her in season 1, season 2, season 3, and these other entities as well, in the Red Room or flashbacks in some cases. So, and I think Lynch specifically could not let Laura go. I know Mark Frost and David Lynch both wrote the character, but Lynch specifically wanted to explore her role and her backstory in the film. And so for me, the ghost idea came to me because, Laura Palmer was a haunted character, haunted literally by Bob, who was trying to possess her. But the town was also haunted by her death. She'd had such an impact in so many ways in the community, and they couldn't let her go. I mean, her death, made so many things arise about the evils in the town and the good in the town that she did too. And then of course, then another aspect of that ghost is, us, the viewers, are haunted by her story. Cause she, I always want to call her a survivor, but she wasn't a survivor. She didn't actually survive, but she didn't let evil in. And I think that's important. She got to have her own agency in her death. And so that was a big impact too, is she's a ghost who haunts the viewers who, she's impacted so many of us, and, we can't let her go.
Yeah. I mean, it really brings me, reading passages from this book, Laura's Ghost, really made me think a lot about growing up in the 90s on the West Coast and the Polly Klaas case. If you remember the Polly Klaas case, which was a big deal when I was in high school, but it was one of many of missing girls, murders, sexual assaults. I mean, there was this, it was written about in the culture. I mean, we talk a lot on the show about like grunge and like, Nirvana was my entry into it because it was the big popular stuff. But now as I'm older, I realized there was this whole outburst of material from like, bands like Bikini Kill, etc., who were talking about these issues. And it was like something that was around when I was young, but now getting into Twin Peaks makes me realize how much Lynch was sort of engaging with that discourse a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Speaking of the 90s, I think that the whole grunge movement, the girl power, Riot girl power, Bikini Kill, like you were saying, there were these, especially female voices that were talking about these things, but it wasn't it was almost like a subverted or, not in a mainstream way, that we're talking about it now. And so, I think that was definitely part of the culture was pointing out, that violence happens against women. It happens against a lot of people, but it happens, specifically against women. And the data shows it's pretty high numbers. And it's often not taken seriously, or it's kind of normalized in a lot of ways too. Like, oh, this is just what happens. And, it's terrible that it happens, but this is just what happens. And no real effort in a mainstream way to kind of change the culture, change the way we talk about it.
Yeah.
And Lynch was doing that. I mean, I think, you can say what you want about the male gaze. I mean, there's certainly, the male gaze versus the female gaze. There's certainly, a merit to a woman telling, these stories. That's what I was doing with my book. But Lynch was exploring that too. And I think he was, even though he had the male gaze, he was exploring this in a way that I think some of the other women at the time were also talking about it. Laura Palmer's not just a victim. She's a person. She's an individual. She's complex. She's powerful. And violence is a real thing that happens. And so he was doing it in an interesting way when other male filmmakers were not telling these kinds of stories.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of it's weird because I never really put Lynch in with, Riot Girl and, 90s Gen X culture. But at the same time, I'm sitting here thinking like, well, yeah, Twin Peaks had a sort of hipster vibe to it. I feel like it was a sort of, as much as it was a, mainstream TV show, it was like weird people were into it. It was like, it's rare that something that avant-garde is on like mainstream television. But the idea that those cultures could somehow go together, or who would intervene on those ideas is really important to me, because you're right. It was a sort of outsider thing, as much as there were, I think of like, the Riot Girl thing, but being actively opposed to, I guess what we're calling third wave feminism, but like actively opposed to like evangelicals, and like, there was the culture war happening in the 90s that it feels like Lynch is intervening in, but not in a really like one side or the other. He's like, he wants to go deep dark into the mystery. I feel maybe that's why his show his work confuses a lot of people that don't know how to sort of take this stuff in.
Yeah. And along with that too, going along with evangelical, but I don't like to be preached to in my art. Mm-hmm. And I think most people probably feel the same way, even if we're agreeing with a certain sentiment. And so that's one of the things I appreciate about Twin Peaks or Laura's Ghost, is it's not taking this evident political stance, but it's humanizing. I think, women and people just want to be humanized in art. Mm-hmm. They don't want to be reduced to a caricature, unless you're doing satire or something like that. And so I think that he was humanizing, but also shining a light on the real violence and how, like, sometimes it's difficult to watch, this is not something behind the scenes. And so he's shining a light on that. And that was important for a lot of us who were watching it at the time, and still important for people who are watching it now for the first time.
Yeah, it's funny. The male gaze thing is one element of it. I appreciate that at the beginning of your book, you sort of lay out that there are many different conversations to be had about Lynch's work, and in Twin Peaks in particular. You could talk about it as a tourist vision of one artist, or you can talk about it in terms of how it changed television history. There are so many angles on it, but this particular one, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about Cheryl Lee. And because I read Lynch's book Room to Dream. It's a memoir that, which she's a part of, and she talks a little bit of, and I think it's in there that she describes how when she was cast as a dead body, she wasn't cast as like an actress on this show. How did that evolve, and how did her backstory become such an important part of Twin Peaks? Because it seems like a lot of what your work is doing is kind of recovering this story of like who Laura Palmer really is, that you don't really find out more until later. The show ultimately becomes almost all about her. And of course, the movie is entirely her life. Yeah.
She, her character starts off as this plot device, this MacGuffin. She's, like you said, a dead girl on a beach. She's been murdered. What happened? And they could have easily left the story there and not sort of peeled back the onion of who she was and her relationship to the town. And of course, Fire Walk with Me, when we get to really know her backstory. And then the Secret Diary of Laura Palmer, the book that comes out between season 1 and season 2, that really dives into who she was. Yeah, she was a theater person. She actually was not interested in doing film and TV. And she got cast, I think, through her headshots. And she was originally she was asked if she could be if she could stand the cold, because they were in, Washington on the beach, and she was going to be nude. And she was called in for that, and she thought that was going to be it. And then they ended up calling her back to do some flashbacks, the picnic scene and some other scenes. Of course, the red room, she ends up being in the red room too. And so Lynch kept calling her back. And I think he was enamored with her, not just as a beautiful woman, but as this concept of, who is this character who's dead, and how is she existing in the world in the past, but also in this mysterious, supernatural place he's created in terms of the red room. And then he has said over the years, and I think he talks about it in A Room to Dream, he couldn't leave her alone. And that's why he had to go back and do Fire Walk with Me. And even in season 3, her iconic image is on the opening credits, and she's back in the red room. She's back as Carrie Page. So he just couldn't seem to leave her alone. So she keeps coming back.
You mentioned Jennifer Lynch there too, his daughter, who I didn't realize this until I think reading Room to Dream, honestly. It's funny because I was such a huge fan of Lynch for a long time, and I'm like, wow, how did I never know all this stuff? How did I not know the whole narrative of how he made Eraserhead, or all those things that seem to be, to me now, really important parts of understanding what he's trying to do in cinema and in painting and all the art he does. But how did Jennifer Lynch become involved in this? Because she was really young, and it seems like it's a critical part of what, the angle and the story that you're telling about Twin Peaks is Jennifer Lynch sort of connecting to the character in a really deep way.
Yeah, she's a talented filmmaker in her own right. Now she's done quite a bit of film, quite a bit of TV too. Really, really mainstream, great TV shows, The Walking Dead, Quantico, American Horror Story, and her own films too. But at the time she was really young, she was a storyteller. She had PA, she'd been a personal assistant on set, and she has said in the book and in some other places too that when she was young, when she was a child, she had always wanted to find out if other little girls felt the same way she did. She always wanted to find a diary to see if she could find out. And she had mentioned that to her father. And I think he kept that in his head. And I think he also just trusted her. He knew she was going to be a good storyteller. He knew that she could do it, and he knew that he could trust her, because at some point he had to tell her, who the murderer was. And he knew, she keep it close to home. She could keep it secret. But he trusted her with that story, giving the backstory of Laura Palmer and the diary and everything leading up to it. And I was really struck when I was writing my book, because, I had read the diary, but I didn't realize how much it resonated with other women that I'd interviewed till I started talking to them. And they said the diary, because it really does dig into this young girl's life in a way that show can't and doesn't, that they, especially when they were young reading it, that it really resonated with them, hearing this young girl's voice. And Jennifer Lynch she was not a child, but she was still young when she wrote it. So she could tap into that pretty easily.
God, it reminds me of that movie 13, like the like sort of like taking a very young girl's voice and trying to and what you end up with is such a hybrid vision. It's sort of like David Lynch directing the ideas from that he sort of like really desperately needs this perspective. He needs to hear about like what the young girl's diary entries are going to be like, because he can't access that. God, that's really incredible.
Yeah. And he knew he could not access that. I mean, it's a sign of a wise person is knowing your limits and what you can and can't do, what you do and you don't know. And I think it's brilliant that he brought her in to tell that story.
Yeah. I wonder in terms of the movie, because the Fire Walk with Me is, Twin Peaks is one thing. And I think that, Twin Peaks has a kind of quirky fun to it that is not very present in Fire Walk with Me. Like, Fire Walk with Me is like insanely, devastatingly dark and nightmarish. I actually watched it again for the first time in a while, just like a few months ago, and I paused it. I think I didn't finish it. I think the last like 15 minutes, the last sequence, that in fact the sequence in the bar, the last sort of spiral of Laura Palmer, was getting to me. Like, for whatever reason, the COVID year, it was so graphic, and I don't mean visually, I just mean in the weight of what it's portraying. People were not happy with that movie, right? Like, for Twin Peaks fans in general were sort of like I think maybe it was too heavy for them. Or what do you think?
I think it was too heavy for a lot of people. There's a lot of people who are David Lynch fans, and then people who are Twin Peaks fans, and they don't always converge. And if you're a David Lynch fan, you expect the darkness, you expect to be shaken a little bit. Yeah. When you come from the show, that's it does have some serious plot points and developments, but it's also about the cherry pie and the coffee. And those are great things too. I enjoy those things. The donuts, all that, and the quirkiness of it. But Fire Walk with Me was not. It's about the last days of a teenage girl's life she's being sexually abused, and, she's being possessed. And it's tough, and the camera does not turn away from it. It is in your face. And so I think a lot of people that enjoyed the show, that was difficult for them to, and it's also, at the time, we were not talking about sexual abuse or incest. We were not talking about these things.
Are we now is the question. I think more so. There has been, we're sitting here waiting to see if Andrew Cuomo is going to resign in New York. There is a wider conversation about it, but at the same time, incest and rape, things happening within families. This is stuff that touches on some of the most taboo subjects that people don't want to handle. And I wonder why Lynch was drawn to it, because, you mentioned he has this secret that he's mentioned that he's that he shares with Jennifer as she's writing her diary. And the secret is that the murderer is Laura's father. And I wonder do we know when Lynch decided that, and how important was, in other words, how important was this element to him? Because it seems like the fact that once the show ended and he had the opportunity to make a movie and return to this material, he condensed the story down to that nightmare. It seems like that was really important to him.
Yeah. I don't know the exact time when they made this decision. Mm-hmm. I know that they were bandying about several different people. At least they had shot several different with I think Ben Horn, and I think they shot with Bob and Leland. And so they were banding out some names, but I think it's particularly devastating that it's Leland, because it's her father, it's in her home. That's where you're supposed to be safe and protected. And Leland seemed like such a vulnerable character, at first too.
Oh, yeah.
It made it so much more impactful. So I don't know all the thinking behind that, because Lynch doesn't always talk about the process or the thinking behind it. But yeah, I think it was devastating. And of course, that taboo subject, it wasn't just abuse, it was abuse in the home by a father to a daughter. And so I think that was a very powerful story to tell, and a very shocking one to tell too.
Yeah, the Leland character is seriously one of the most fucked up characters I've ever seen in anything. In part because of the balance of corniness and hokiness and the absolute nightmare that he is or is possessed by. All of him dancing around and singing, and his kind of light as a feather Broadway personality. It to me, we're talking about the old Twin Peaks is the sort of, there's the corny Twin Peaks and the fun Twin Peaks, and then there's the dark Twin Peaks. But it seems like Lynch is mixing it all up for us, and that's America for him, is this corny, hokey place that is also possessed by absolute devilish, nightmarish secrets. Yeah,
you're right, and I think there's a realness to that too, because people are rarely one or the other, and going back to Cuomo or someone like him, who may be a very charismatic person, who a lot of people could say, this is a great guy, I know this person, but maybe there's another side that you don't always see. And I think that a lot of times when we hear from abuse victims, that's sometimes it's somebody who really charismatic or who's presenting one face, but there might be another side, and I think Lynch is really good at showing that. With Leland, it's hard to imagine somebody like Leland who's quirky and fun and can dance and knows Broadway tunes and seems caring, but yet he's doing these horrible acts of violence.
Yeah, I think it's God, she's so good. I mean, Cheryl Lee is so good in this thing, and there's a moment in the movie when she discovers it's Leland. She goes home. She goes home like in the afternoon. At a moment when she was not usually home, and she sees Bob, but then she sees her dad, and like she understands it's the same person. I think she's like laying in the grass, like watching him come out. Her response when she says, "Oh my God," like when is honestly like her delivery is filled with so much pathos. I wonder how many takes they had to do on that, because it's just she captures something that I feel like. I wonder if you could talk about this, because it feels like she's not just Laura Palmer. She's like a collection of people. She's like an archetypal. I don't want to say victim, because I don't think of Laura Palmer as just a victim. I think of her as a living entity with an important life. But can you talk a little bit about that? Because it feels like, especially the new Twin Peaks, the season 3 is really about identity and like split identities. It seems like that's a theme of your book too.
Yeah, Cheryl Lee is an incredible actor, and she that part, I think, really, she's talked a little bit about it, but I think that part was really difficult for her because of the emotional toll, because she was so invested in it. I mean, so I think some actors can come, depending on your method and everything, can come to set, do the scene and leave. And this was, I think she throws her whole body, heart, and soul into it. And it's also a difficult character to play. It's not, just a small minor, part. She had to carry this movie. And she has told me over the years, she's had so many women and people come to her and say, thank you for playing this character. This is my story too. And I think she carries that with her. And I think she brought it to the role back then. And I think she is still bringing it to her work now. I don't know how she made that film because of the emotional toll. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's communicated in, I mean, oftentimes just her being. I'm thinking about a scene, I think it's in the film, in which, I wonder what happened to Laura. What did happen to Laura? Because there's some agency to her. That's why I sort of said that she's not. I don't think of her as a victim, because she's sort of dancing with death or something. Something's going on with Laura, where she's being drawn into darkness at the same time this dark stuff is happening to her. To me, it's very recognizable. In the sense of like the women that were around me when I was young. My first girlfriend in high school was like a riot girl who had been sexually abused and was acting out with drugs and alcohol. And it was an archetypal sort of personality in my youth, for sure, was meeting young women who had experienced really rotten shit and had been been an integral part of the formation of their identity. It seems like Laura Palmer is that's partly the story that's trying to be touched on there, is this sort of like her own engagement with darkness in a much more sort of complicated way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And like you said, with your girlfriend, there's so many people that are traumatized or going through something that are self-medicating, not just experimenting for fun, but definitely self-medicating. And that's a sign. I mean, that's in some ways, Dr. Jacoby talks about it in Twin Peaks. In some ways it's a positive sign because you're seeking medication, even though it's not good for you. And so she was certainly doing that and acting out sexually too. She had sexual agency, but you wonder how much of that was her just acting out because of what happened to her versus her choosing because she wanted to do that. And yeah, I mean, her character is so evident of the things that we talk about now that, sexual abuse survivors go through and in terms of acting out and drugs. And it was definitely happening to her. But yeah, I think that darkness was, Bob's ultimate goal was to get control of her, and she wouldn't let him in. And that's where her agency lies. Not, I know she ends up dying and going through everything, but her agency lies in not letting him inside.
And the most haunting part of it to me is her seeming to know that this is happening to her, but being unable to really articulate it. That part of it is just so there. It seems like it's a common sentiment expressed in the women that are featured in your book. Is one that's like, Laura could have been saved, or there was an opportunity for some other path for her, but for a million different reasons she she can't get out of this. But at the same time, it's really interesting to hear you say that there is a sort of victory for her in sort of maintaining her identity against these literal like demons that are trying to possess her.
Yeah, and I look at it as I'm a big believer in free will. I think there's some things we can't choose, but I'm a big believer in free will. And for Laura, if you compare Laura and Leland, I think you see the strength in Laura. Leland let Bob in. I think there's at some point when he made maybe a series of choices or maybe one choice where he allowed Bob in.
Yeah.
And Laura knew it was happening, but she wasn't going to let him in. And even if she had to sacrifice herself. And to me, that's where the agency lies. She knew it was happening, but knew that she had to take every step that she could to not let herself be possessed, essentially.
I want to know, because I'm jealous that you get to write about Twin Peaks and think about this stuff so much. I want to how did this happen for you in terms of your interest in Twin Peaks and Lynch's work, and how did that develop? Because I imagine that you were already working on things when The Return happened, and I mean, God, I forget now the sequence of events of when we knew that Twin Peaks was coming back, but I didn't ever think that we were going to see Twin Peaks again in my lifetime. And not only did it come back, but it came back with some really, intense episodes. I mean, that show, the new show, I think I'm going to be grappling with for a long time. Every time I watch it, I'm like, have I seen this before? Like, it's such an incredible wash of insanity. But how did you get to study Twin Peaks and write about it?
Well, I watched the show when it originally aired and loved it at the time. It spoke to me. And then I started writing about it almost for fun in a way about 8 or 9 years ago. I went to the University of Southern California, had a retrospective for their film students on Twin Peaks over a period of 6 months. And they showed all the episodes in Fire Walk with Me, and they would bring in members of the show and people who'd worked on the show and interview them. And it was geared towards film and students. So not really fans necessarily, but it was open to the public. And so I went to all of them and started covering it for a blog I was writing. And then that's when I started tapping into that community. People would read my blog, or I'd meet people at these events. And the community opened up a whole world for me too, is a way to kind of connect with people through the show. But that's when I really started becoming interested in writing about it. And again, it was for fun. And then I started doing some academic writing too for it. Then I joined the Blue Rose magazine, which is sort of the legacy of John Thorne's Wrapped in Plastic, which was the the zine of its day. We have our own magazine now with myself, Scott Ryan, and John Thorne. Mm-hmm. And we started that in 2016 in anticipation of the show coming back. We said, yeah, let's start this magazine. We write about the show. We all have different personalities and takes. And so I started doing that, and Laura's Ghost sort of emerged from there. I mean, in 2016 is when we started the magazine. That's also when I came up with the book idea too. And it took me a while to get the book going. Mm-hmm. But I've really just enjoyed writing about the show, writing about David Lynch. I feel like there's endless, things that you can say. Just when I think I'm done writing about, Lynch or the show, I'll read someone else has written and it inspires me, or I'll go back to it and I have a different take. And I don't think I'll ever stop engaging with it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think about him a lot in terms of, especially after reading Room to Dream, in terms of his artistic practice and his sort of take on spirituality and how he connects those things. I wonder what you could say about that, because one of the things that comes through in your work is Twin Peaks and I would say this probably about all of his work. I think Eraserhead, Mulholland Drive, all of them he's engaging with some like spirituality on some level. And you describe Twin Peaks as a spiritual work of art. What do you mean by that? And I know that like there's the TM thing, like transcendental meditation is like a big part of how Lynch conceives of consciousness and art even, but what is the spiritual element? I think you're totally right. I wonder just what you mean by that.
Yeah, it's something I'm still trying to figure out too. The spirituality of it, but it exists there for me. And Lynch has said, based on the Maharishi's saying, the world is as you are. So you are bringing, your perception of what you're bringing to the world is what you are. And I don't practice TM, and I appreciate it, but I don't practice it. But for me, I think real art does have a spiritual aspect of it. And I think his art leaves enough mystery to where you can fill in those spaces with what you're bringing to it. And I think that's why it means different things to different people, but we can also find some commonality. And that's where, that's where we can sort of tap into whatever that spiritual side is in us. We're finding it in his work because he leaves those spaces open. His room to dream idea, leaving room to dream. He leaves that room to dream for us when we're watching his work, that we can, again, bring our own selves to the project, to the work.
Yeah, I wonder what that fan community is like. I mean, it seems like, there are a lot. There's a lot, right? I mean, it feels like I had some experience with fandom in the 90s when I went to an X-Files convention, and was really into X-Files culture. And you make contact with that stuff. What it's interesting because fan culture seems like it's gotten even bigger. Like it's even more, with the internet and like niche sort of culture. People are doing their own things. What is Twin Peaks culture like? Because it seems like, I do like a Google search on like Twin Peaks tattoos, and it's just like a whole world of like thousands of people that have really incredible tattoos. Like I'm like, oh, look at that idea. Look at that idea. There's a lot of people that have that, like, meanwhile with the hands, with Laura's hands. I just think it's such a cool, and again, like open to interpretation, beautifully rendered sort of piece of who Laura is. But I wonder what's your experience with the fan community, and how much are they engaged with this part of what you're doing with Twin Peaks, which is about sort of the deep, dark, gendered themes of what Lynch is doing. How much is that a part of the wider Twin Peaks world?
Yeah, the Twin Peaks community is, I think, bigger than ever because of social media, and there's ways to connect. But it's still a very niche, small group. And there's people that are peripherally engaged. I like the show, but I don't remember much of it. Or there's people that know every single line and every single aspect of the show. I mean, people say I'm a big fan, but there are people who know so much. They know camera shots and all this kind of stuff off the top of their head. But I would say in general, the community tends to be very kind compared to other fan communities. And maybe it's because it's smaller, more niche, but that's also a part of the show. I mean, Cooper is a good person. Cooper is a kind person. They tend to be artistic or appreciate art a lot. Like you said, the tattoos, there's some really elaborate tattoos. I mean, I have so many friends who have Twin Peaks tattoos, whether it's one or, a bunch of, I don't have any tattoos, but I have friends who are just loaded up with Twin Peaks tattoos.
Amazing.
And art and tattoo artists who I know are fans too, who do their own art. But yeah, the women I interviewed for the book, a lot of them are doing something creative, whether it's writing or art, photography. It tends to be just a very creative bunch of people. And of course, there are people who, appreciate, like we were talking about earlier, the quirkier parts, the donuts and coffee, or dressing up, cosplay. That's all fun. I would say it's probably a smaller group who really want to engage with the darker side of Twin Peaks because it is difficult. A lot of people have, come around or appreciate, what Laura's story. We were talking more about Laura Palmer than we ever have been. Traditionally, we'd be talking about Cooper.
That's right.
Yeah. And now we're talking much more about Laura Palmer. And I think that's a really good thing. And I don't think it's just because of my book. I think it's because of many, many different things. But I think more people are engaging in that topic now than they used to.
Yeah, no, I mean, maybe that is like the Me Too thing, because Me Too became such a like sort of big like branded movement. And the question of like, would it really be able to challenge these deeply entrenched power, and not only the power, but like we go back to Twin Peaks. Like it's almost like Me Too is pointing us back to Twin Peaks. Look at this story. Look at how dynamic this social phenomenon of abuse and assault and patriarchy and all these things tied together. It feels like, again, it's not on the nose stuff. He's not preaching about like men are bad or something like that. I mean, Lynch's work is really getting at some of the, subterranean. I think about Blue Velvet and the opening shots of like the camera crawling down into underneath the green lawn of the suburban house and finding all these like festering bugs and grubs and worms. I mean, feels like that's what Lynch is showing us. And it feels like that, what your work is showing us is that a lot of it has to do with our sort of attitudes and actions around sex and women and gender. I mean, reading your book is overwhelming in terms of how much it connected with me in terms of what I think Lynch is giving us. I mean, there's a lot going on in his work, but it's there too.
Yeah, yeah, and you know the thing about engaging with a work like this is with the abuse aspect of it too. Is we're talking about it more, we're engaging with it more, and it's not being preached to us. I'm really glad that we're having these type of conversations because I think Lynch opens up a whole world when he's confronting this violence and confronting it directly in the way that he's doing.
What do you think? I mean, like I said, the return is so huge. I don't even know what to do with it. And I started watching it again a couple weeks ago. I think I'm on episode 4. And it is a lot about Cooper. I mean, and that's part of why I brought up that idea of like Laura Palmer being a split identity, because it feels like in the return, he's really wants to hit that theme. But the kind of quirky cherry pie eating, coffee drinking Cooper is barely in the return as well. What do we do with that? Because it feels like it's sort of like he's sort of exploring. I don't know. I don't want to get into my our close readings and answers here, but it feels like Cooper's split identity is sort of exploring like archetypal sort of male personalities, and that fucking evil Cooper with the long hair is seriously. I didn't think Kyle MacLachlan could pull off something that scary, and he's really intense in it.
Yeah, I never could have imagined Kyle MacLachlan would be scary, but he's absolutely and the dark pools of his eyes with those contacts are terrifying.
Dude.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting take. Is the idea that Cooper becomes the fractured selves, the really evil self, and then also the pure goodness of Dougie, that enjoys food and enjoys the pleasures of life and is kind and all of this stuff. And a lot of people have written, this is not just coming from me, of how it can be read as the story in season 3 can be read as a comment on nostalgia too, that you can't truly go back. None of us can truly go back to what that was in the early 90s. So what is the story now? And we shouldn't expect, I wouldn't expect, Bill, I didn't want to go down a nostalgia trip. And, you could have hit all the right plot points and marks to be purely nostalgic. And a lot of shows do that if they're rebooted or if they're sequels. And I'm glad it didn't do that. It gave us something new to wrestle with. And for me, I was very interested in the story of Laura Palmer in season 3. What was that going to be? And the way I've kind of come to terms with the ending, I'm still coming to terms with it, but is when when Cooper or whoever that entity is, person is, brings Carrie Page back to the Palmer house. That's the original site of her trauma. To me, that last scene was revealing that we can't escape trauma. We can't escape what happened, and it is a stark and terrifying and, something I grapple with, that ending, when he takes her back to the house and the kids go out. I don't know what's happening there, but it is a loaded scene with everything that's happened to Laura Palmer, no matter who Carrie Page is. And I think that's what he was, coming back to with the audience.
Yeah, it feels like a timeless hell that they're in there. When she screams, when he says, "What year is this?" and she screams, I still it's so chilling. And I remember thinking the first time I watched it, knowing that it was the ending, knowing absolutely this is how he's going to end it, and waiting for the credit to show up, because it's such a perfect way of sort of leaving that crack open of what is this story and why is this woman reacting this way. But it also felt like the connection with the Grace Zabriskie character, haunting that house, because she feel like Sarah Palmer, Laura's mother. Yeah, that great piece you have in this book with Grace Zabriskie. I'm so glad she's in the book, because she's such an intense, Lynchian figure, in so many of his movies and in Twin Peaks, of course. But can you talk a little bit about her? Because it felt like she's really present there in that last scene there, with the lights flickering in that house, even though you don't see her. She, to me, is such a critical doorway into understanding a lot of what they're doing with Laura and just the idea of gender in the piece.
Yeah, and you know that last scene, you do hear her voice from the original series calling out Laura's name too.
Right,
so she's
right.
You know, her voice is in there too. Yeah, and that's her home. You know, yeah, you know, Grace Zabriskie is this teeny tiny petite little. I mean, I'm a small, but she's even smaller than I am. And yet she is a presence. She commands a room. You know, when I interviewed her in person, and you know, I was a little intimidated by her because it's Grace Zabriskie and she's played these iconic roles and intimidating roles. She's like, I always get cast as this crazy person because she can always play those crazy people with levels and complexity. And yeah, I mean, she brought to Sarah Palmer such depth and such intensity. And in season 3, we don't know what's going on with Sarah Palmer. Is she possessed? Is she really Sarah Palmer? What's going on in that home? Who's in that home with her? There's such an intensity that she brings to that role in the original series and in season 3.
Yeah, you can really feel the wreckage of it, and I think that's why I love the title of your book, kind of indicating a haunting, you know, with Laura's ghost, because it feels like I love that idea that this isn't nostalgia. I mean, every reboot sucks, and every time there's a reboot, I'm always cringing. I'm like, everyone's going to look weird. There's going to be some of the characters or some of the actors have had plastic surgery. You know, everything feels awkward, and they're just going to try to say get to the lines that everybody loved before. And I mean, I know that Lynch wouldn't do that. And I was, you know, obviously kind of had faith that he wouldn't, but he took it to another level, and it feels like he took it to a level that was very much connected to the themes from the first show and the themes from Fire Walk with Me. I mean, honestly, the return feels a lot like Fire Walk with Me in terms of how deep and heavy it is. Yeah, God. I'm going to be grappling with this stuff for a while.
I know. I mean, season 3 is something that I think we're going to be talking about for a long time to come because I still haven't fully processed it. But you're right about Fire Walk with Me because Lynch said, you know, he said my inspiration was Fire Walk with Me, not necessarily the original series, but Fire Walk with Me. And I think it was a clue that this is going to tap into some of those themes, but also it's going to be darker. It's not going to be, you know, the quirky, happy story that we are coming to expect.
The shot of Grace Zabriskie, the first time you see her in the return, I think, she's on the couch where you first see Bob by accident, Frank Silva in the mirror there. But she's she's obviously older, but she's watching TV and smoking cigarettes and drinking Bloody Marys. And what she's watching on TV is like some of the most like savage like nature footage of like animals ripping each other apart. She says nothing in that scene. I think it's just a vision of her. That's all. And she inhabits that horror so well. I think of her in Inland Empire too. Is just such an energy. I wonder. I know we should wrap up here, but I wanted to ask you about Lynch's sort of presence on the internet in the COVID year. It feels like Lynch is just more popular than ever. And he's like. I watch those YouTube videos that he puts out every day of his weather report and his picking a number activity. What has he been up to with that? And like how does that fit into the whole like Blue Rose Twin Peaks fandom? Like how much is Lynch himself a sort of beloved figure? Because it seems like part of what people like about him is he like sits in his workshop and he almost models like how to be an artist.
Yeah, you know, I mean, people in the Twin Peaks fan community love Lynch for the most part. You know, we love Mark Frost too, but for many of us, it's David Lynch who is the artist that we aspire to be or want to watch and see what he's doing. And I think Lynch has remained pretty much the same. I mean, I don't know about his whole psychology or inside his home, but I mean, he's always, all the years that he's been on set, he's worn like the navy jacket and the khakis. And now he's living the artist life where he's working on woodworking and building furniture and maybe doing some other things. And that's all he's always done that. And we're just more aware of it. And he's probably more aware of it too, because he didn't like to leave the house originally before the pandemic, and now he can't. So he's kind of stuck at home, but he's doing the same things that he's always done. And we have, you know, a lot of us are stuck at home and we're doing those same things too. Like some people have picked up projects, making bread or sewing or, you know, whatever it is. And so I feel like people can relate to the situation that he's in now and kind of look to him as inspiration for creating art. And I think the weather report, I mean, that's something he used to do quite a bit online. Yeah. And he's bringing it back. And I think it's just something almost like a meditative practice where every morning he gets up and he tells us the weather, and it's simple. It's no more than that. And it's a ritual. And I think we are craving ritual right now because some of us are inside our homes day in and day out. And we like having that ritual. And especially if it's a really positive ritual too. There's nothing really negative about the weather, especially in Los Angeles.
Yeah, right. Seeing him every day does have a sort of spiritual element to it. And the picking of the number and the sort of like occult practice or whatever he's doing with that. It's such a different vision of who Lynch was to me as a young person coming of age, like in the 80s and 90s. And Lynch was presented as this scary guy that, you know, weirdo that made weird. He's so like him as a personality, him as an artist seems so different than that. I mean, I'm thinking about, and I mean, honestly, this has to do with your work because it has to do with attitudes about women. Because I think about like I read Roger Ebert. I talk about it a lot on the show. I had my mind twisted by reading too many Roger Ebert reviews when I was young because he's got a very particular perspective and set of expectations when it comes to movies. And he very famously gave like Blue Velvet and Wild at Heart like 0 stars. He said they were misogynist. He said that what Lynch did with Isabella Rossellini in Blue Velvet was unforgivable, which is really interesting considering reading Rossellini's sort of narrative in Room to Dream about her own experience, which is so much more complicated than the way Ebert sort of portrayed it. But anyway, my point is that when I was young, I grew up with Lynch thinking of like, this is kind of like an edgy, nasty guy that like make art about like maybe that exploits women, you know, maybe that's what it was. And so in other words, reading your book in the 21st century in 2021 and reading about all these women who have reacted to his work in you know, all these different, very, you know, really vibrant ways, it really changes the perspective. Lynch is like a different person in my mind now. And so I just wanted to, I guess, thank you for writing it because I think it provides a really kind of clear picture or a clearer picture of what this art is about and who this artist is.
Well, thank you for saying that too. I really, it means a lot to me when someone can find something in the book that, you know, taps into them and they get something out of it like that. And, Lynch is not perfect, of course. And there are going to be people and have been people who are critical of him and the way he approaches women.
Yeah.
But my experience and my take on it is going to be a little bit different. I think he, for me, he's had a big impact on me because he humanizes the women. He shines a light on it. I think he treats it, not as an exploitive way, but there's a very realness to it. And I appreciate that. But I do know that there are some other people who do take issue with some of his stuff. And there's room for those conversations too, which is great.
I absolutely agree. And those conversations are a vital part of getting kind of the total understanding of it. I mean, I have to say, and I taught a film class once where I showed Mulholland Drive. The students reacted very negatively to it. Like they weren't Lynch people. They were young, 18 years old now. They didn't grow up with Twin Peaks or anything like that. And I think they had in their head that this idea that Lynch was sort of this pretentious artist that made a lot of weird stuff, and that people who, honestly, one of the reactions I got from a student was people like to say they like Lynch films and that they get it because it's like it makes them cool to like Lynch films. And I'm like, I don't know if that's true. Like, I'm not sure if it like makes you cool to be really into Twin Peaks.
I will say I'm one of the least cool people. I've never been cool. So yeah, that is I can't speak for everybody, but I am not cool.
You reject the thesis.
Reject the thesis. Yeah.
Courtney Stallings, this was really fun. Thanks so much for talking with me. These are heavy issues, but I think that what Lynch does for us, I agree that Lynch gives us a way to talk about them. And even when that is a total just difficult, impossible conversation, we have these episodes to go back to and sort of ground us a little bit. And I just want to repeat, the name of your book is Laura's Ghost: Women Speak About Twin Peaks, with a foreword by Cheryl Lee, which I think is one of the most illuminating parts of the book, is just hearing her attitude of how Laura Palmer haunts her too. But really great stuff. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, that is it for today. I want to thank my guest, Courtney Stallings. Go get this book, Laura's Ghost, Women Speak About Twin Peaks. I think it is an absolutely vital angle on the work of David Lynch and decoding exactly what he's doing and what his intervention is. Really, really fun stuff. And go check out the Blue Rose magazine. She's the editor of a Twin Peaks magazine called The Blue Rose. I think if you're interested in this wider world of Twin Peaks fandom, that's the place to start. So thank you, Courtney. Thank you for all the people that are subscribing to the show. I can't tell you how much that means to us. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Lots of bonus material and other things for our subscribers. We will talk to you again very soon. All right, take care. See ya.